So we've had 7 sermons so far in this sermon series that I've been calling The Life of David, studying the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel that talk about the life of David. And I'm guessing you haven't noticed we haven't met David yet. 7 sermons in. Well, we've had to set the historical context, then to learn about the prophet Samuel, which led to the anointing of the first king of Israel, King Saul. We then watched as King Saul has repeatedly disobeyed the Lord, and thus God rejected King Saul as the king of Israel. And that's where the story concluded last week at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 17. So turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 16. If you're reading from one of the Bibles in your pew, it's page 226. 1 Samuel chapter 16, page 226. Here's what we read in the first 5 verses. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Now back up near the beginning in verse 1. I read that. Why is Samuel mourning for Saul? Did he like Saul? Kind of didn't seem that way. But maybe he felt some kind of a responsibility for Saul. He anointed him. Maybe Samuel even viewed himself as a mentor for Saul. Maybe he really wanted Saul to do well. Maybe he felt like Saul's reputation was impacting his own. Maybe he wanted God to just give Saul more chances. You know, it can be difficult to know when to draw the line with someone. You ever been in a situation like that? Now, some of you have personalities that maybe resemble what Samuel is doing here. You might be thinking, sure, Saul messed up. But we all mess up. I know I mess up. We need encouragement. We need hope. We need grace. We need more chances. And isn't God a God of second chances? Isn't God a forgiving, merciful, gracious God? So let's just keep giving Saul more chances, God. Some of you have that personality. But some of you have a different approach. Some of you have a mindset where you're willing to give chances, you're willing to give forgiveness to a person, but if they keep screwing up like Saul did, you believe it's in the best interests of the family, of the company, of the church, to say, enough is enough, you're done. In fact, you may believe it's the most loving thing to do to remove yourself from the person or remove the person from the situation. Samuel doesn't seem to be like that at this point. He can't let go. But God basically steps in and says, Samuel, you have to let it go. Get your prophet gear, pack it up, I'm sending you on a mission. You're going to Bethlehem, and you're going to choose the new king to take over for Saul. Now, what we don't see in the New International Version that you're reading in your pew, you may see it if you have a different version, is this. In the Hebrew, it's something really interesting about the phrase where God says, the new king that I have chosen. In Hebrew, it clearly says, the new king that I have chosen for myself. That's so different from what God said when he chose Saul to be king. In chapter 13, God was choosing Saul because the people asked for a king. He was essentially saying, okay, I'll choose a king because you are asking for a king. But now God is choosing the king that he wants. But Samuel says something ominous in response. Look at verse 2. If Samuel goes on this prophetic mission to anoint a new king, he believes Saul will kill him. Where did that come from? He believes Saul's going to kill him? Is Saul watching his every move? Maybe. When we last left Samuel and Saul in chapter 15, we learned there was actually a major rift between the two of them. Remember, Samuel had declared that God had rejected Saul. Samuel declared that God had torn the kingdom from Saul. Saul pleaded with Samuel to have a worship service with him, to essentially make things look like they're right. Samuel didn't want to do it. There was this big disagreement, but Saul just kept pleading and pleading, begging, even expressing his sorrow for disobeying the Lord. And Samuel basically says, fine, let's do the worship service. My guess is that worship service, because Samuel didn't really want to do it, was a cold, cold affair. It was a worship service where Samuel was just going through the motions and his heart wasn't in it. It was a worship service to make Saul look good or look repentant. And afterward we read, this is at the very end of 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel never went to visit Saul again. So you can imagine what happens as time goes by. Not only is there a split between the two, but Saul would also start to have a heart growing colder and colder, especially towards Samuel. Like, what's wrong with this prophet guy? Why won't he forgive me? Why won't he visit me? Samuel was the former longtime leader of the people. He was still the current prophet priest of God. And here's Saul, the one that Samuel had anointed to be king, and now Samuel declares God has rejected him, that he's torn the kingdom. God has torn the kingdom from Saul. And Samuel shuts it down. You ever been in a relationship like that, where it goes cold and silent? It's difficult. It can create a major rift. I bet that drove Saul to a really dark place. I can totally see Saul having Samuel watched. Can also kind of believe that Samuel knew he was being watched. And so, when God tells Samuel to go to Bethlehem, he knows that Saul is going to find out about this. He also knows that Saul's mental state is not in a place where he can handle this. Saul is already assuming, more than likely, that Samuel is preparing to anoint another king. When Samuel said that the kingdom would be given to one of Saul's neighbors, that meant that God was not planning on giving the kingdom to Saul's descendant, his son, Jonathan. In other words, Saul knows he's lost everything. And yet he's still currently on the throne. We call that a lame duck. The scary thing about a lame duck is they don't have anything to lose anymore. And they can act in very rash ways. And Saul has the power to do something about it. He commands soldiers. And he can think in his mind, I can maybe try to stay in power. If Samuel makes a move to anoint a new king, I can intervene. He could have Samuel killed. So I think Samuel is absolutely right to be concerned in this moment, that he's going to get found out and that Saul is going to try and intervene and harm him. But God assures Samuel, take a heifer, meaning take a sacrifice. That would be seen as normal priestly duty for a priest to go to another town and make a sacrifice, and they wouldn't think anything strange is going on. But when Samuel shows up at Bethlehem, we read that it's not Saul who confronts him. It's the elders of the town of Bethlehem. They're terrified. And they ask him, do you come in peace? That question is used often in the Bible. Do you come in peace? You might think, why would these elders of the town of Bethlehem be afraid of Samuel? He's a priest. But remember that he was also a prophet. He spoke the word of the Lord. And sometimes prophets gave messages of confrontation. Sometimes prophets gave messages that people did not want to hear. When a prophet showed up, it could easily be bad news. So maybe these elders of Bethlehem have reason to be scared. Also, remember that Samuel was a pretty fierce guy. Just glance back at chapter 15, verse 33. Remember what he did there? Because Saul had not totally destroyed the Amalekites, Samuel stepped in and killed the king of the Amalekites. He's bold. And people knew that Samuel was close to God, and that Samuel was not afraid to obey God. So you can understand why he might be an intimidating figure in their minds. When he shows up unexpectedly, they're like, why are you here? What are you doing here? Do you come in peace? It's a legit question. And he says in verse 5, I have come in peace to sacrifice to the Lord, and the people of the town can breathe much easier. The prophet has not come for judgment, but blessing. And so Samuel consecrates them all. He invites them all to attend the sacrifice, because you and I are not used to animal sacrifices as a part of our common expression of our interaction with God. Think of it as a worship service. Samuel is essentially inviting them all to a worship service. But he's really in Bethlehem, not for all of them, but for one family. The family of Jesse. Now, just for a little refresher, Jesse has a famous grandmother. Her name was Ruth. The same woman that the book of Ruth in the Bible is about. It'd be interesting to know if she was still alive at this point. Don't know. There are a couple factors that make the person of Ruth really interesting. First of all, she was not a Jew. She was from the country nearby called Moab. Second, when her first husband, who was a Jew, died, she stayed committed to her Jew mother-in-law Naomi rather than leaving Naomi and going back to her hometown. And then Ruth found favor in the eyes of a man there named Boaz. They married, and they had a son named Obed, who was Jesse's father. That's the family that Samuel goes to visit. And so there in Bethlehem, Samuel consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to the worship service, and that's when this story starts to get really interesting. Look at verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab, this is one of Jesse's sons, and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his height or his appearance, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, in a future chapter is where we learn that Eliab is the oldest of Jesse's sons. And Samuel thinks to himself, oh, look at this guy. He's the oldest. He looks great. He's the one I have come to anoint to be the next king of Israel. But God says, do not consider his appearance or his height. Now we've learned a little something here about Samuel. This is twice in a row now that Samuel seems to fixate on outward appearance. Remember before when he picked Saul? Saul was tall. Apparently, the dark and handsome type. As if all that's needed to be God's pick is to be tall. Good looks, good frame. That describes Saul, and now it describes Eliab. God is essentially saying here to Samuel, hey Samuel, remember how that worked out for you last time? Remember Saul? He was tall and handsome, but he was not a man after my own heart. Saul looked good on the outside, but I look on the inside. So God is revealing to us a bit about how God thinks. God doesn't think like humans think. We humans, we do tend to be very focused on the outward. That's how our culture is, fixated often on outward appearance. Think about how much emphasis there is on having good skin, toned muscles, a certain body mass index, dieting, working out. Now, there's no doubt about it that some of this is very beneficial for good health, good quality of life. I've really been impressed with Dove soap and their Redefining Beauty campaign. And this is what they say on their website. Join us in challenging toxic beauty standards and creating a more inclusive definition of beauty. If you ever watched Dove commercials, the models that they use are not all just, what you would typically think of as a model. They're all shapes and sizes and skin types and all different colors. It's really amazing. And they do a lot working with people who are struggling with outward appearance because of the influence of our culture. Now, it can feel like a tension. I get it. We're trying not to overemphasize outward appearance, while at the same time, we don't want to de-emphasize health. We don't want to de-emphasize appearance. We're not saying that we should go around looking absolutely terrible or disheveled or unhealthy. And so the principle of God looking at the heart has been overemphasized to the point where some people conclude that we shouldn't ever look at outward appearance. And one way some people have talked about this is that we should be colorblind. That we shouldn't see skin color, we should only look at the heart. And it sounds like a great application of the principle. Except for the fact that the color is God-given. And we shouldn't ignore that. The variety of colors and features of human ethnicity is a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. Human diversity is wonderful. It was created by God. At my daughter's graduation from Conestoga Valley this past week, we there in the audience got to see the beauty of ethnic diversity. It was in full bloom. There were as many students with the last name Torres as there were with the last name Stoltzfus. Very interesting for Conestoga Valley. There were as many students with African heritage as there were with European heritage. Conestoga Valley School District has been reporting for years that our community is changing. We're seeing a shifting demographic. If you look at the pie chart that they send out in their newsletter mailing, every year it's moving a little bit more and more towards diversity. And for this year, the first time, we went past the 50-50 mark. So that in Conestoga Valley, we are only 48% white and 52% persons of color. I mentioned that to a resident of Lampeter, Strasburg a couple weeks ago, and literally their mind was blown because it's not like that in their community. Our Conestoga Valley diversity is a beautiful thing, and we should not be colorblind to it. But as we embrace diversity, we emphasize the heart and looking inward. We do not judge people based on what we see outward. That could be their skin color, that could be their features, it could be the way they talk, the way they dress, it could be their age, it could be their gender. What God is saying is that we don't prejudge, we don't have prejudice. Samuel was having a case of prejudice. He likes what he sees in Eliab. But God says, Samuel, you can't see what I see. There's more to the story here. Move on, Samuel, because I've picked someone else. Thankfully, Jesse has more sons. Here's what happens in verses 8 through 11. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? got me wondering, do these guys know why Samuel is asking to see them? No, next one. There's no indication in the text that Samuel has revealed to them the purpose of this visit. I mean, yeah, he's having a worship service, but why would he be like saying, okay, let's worship service? No, not you. Has he ever told them yet that he's there to select one of them as the next king? And would they be okay with that? Would Jesse and his sons also be concerned with the current king finding out about this? Was Samuel essentially bringing a heap of trouble to this family? I mean, can you imagine being told by Samuel, I'm here to anoint you to be the next king because God has rejected King Saul and you're going to be that next king? I'd be thinking, is the current king okay with this? Has he given his blessing? Is he just going to relinquish his throne? And what about his sons? They're supposed to be next in line to the throne, aren't they? Does anybody remember that guy Jonathan, his oldest son, really seems to be a great guy? Why aren't you picking him? Maybe they have no idea what Samuel's deeper purpose is here. Maybe when their father Jesse brings them out to meet Samuel one by one, they're just thinking they're going to assist him with some work. The prophet needs help. Either way, Samuel is now out loud saying, the Lord hasn't chosen this one, and the Lord hasn't chosen this one, all the way through, 7 of them. So as those sons are not chosen, one by one, we're not told how Samuel makes this decision. How is he hearing from the Lord? It really doesn't seem to be an audible voice. More likely, as we learned in verse 7, it just seems as though God is speaking inwardly to Samuel through his mind. And so Samuel runs through these oldest 7, and God chooses none of them. If I'm Samuel, at this point, I'm starting to think to myself, what is going on, Lord? You sent me here on this kind of risky mission to Bethlehem to anoint a new king, but you're not choosing anybody. What's going on? Are these all the sons you have, Jesse? And Jesse answers in the second half of verse 11, there is still the youngest. He's tending the sheep. Samuel said to send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So there is one more, the youngest. Now, by outward appearance, the selection was almost certainly not going to be the youngest son. In that cultural context, choosing the youngest of 8 brothers made no sense. It would have been a cultural slight to the oldest brothers, and especially to the one who was firstborn. You always choose the eldest first. And then you go down the line from there. You don't choose the youngest. And birth order studies bear this out. How many firstborns do we have here? A couple of you. Those firstborn tend to be the most responsible, tend to be by the book, can get a little bit, legalistic, hardworking. Then there's the middle children, right? How many middle children? Tend to be a little bit more like risk takers, a little bit more like think outside the box, dreamers, that kind of thing. Youngest children, though, how many of you are more on the youngest side? Any youngest? I mean, you're the spoiled ones, right? You know what my boys call their little sister? Because I have 3 boys and a girl. She's the queen. And they usually don't mean it in an adoring way. They adore her, though. They just think she had it easier than they did. They're probably right. I won't lie. But here's the thing. Birth order studies don't mean that a person is locked in to these ideas about birth order. Maybe a person has no siblings. Maybe you're an only child and you can achieve, or a younger person or a middle person can achieve in very different ways. However, you can see those 7 older brothers looking down on their little sibling thinking, oh, let's bring out the little shepherd who's tending his lambs. There's no way he's going to get picked. Here's what happens. Look at verse 12. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord powerfully came upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Finally meet him. This is the first time David is mentioned in our story by name. He's the youngest, but he's God's pick. Now it's interesting that they mention all this outward stuff about David, but there's something more going on. We actually met him already, but we didn't know it. If you go back to chapter 13, verse 14, this is right after King Saul disobeyed God, and Samuel said these prophetic words to Saul, "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Samuel's talking about David. Samuel didn't know it then, but now he does, and he's looking at him right in his face. God says, he's the one. Anoint him. This is the man after my own heart. And it's not about his outward appearance. It is about the fact that his heart is after my heart. He's the next king. And so Samuel anoints the young man David, and the Spirit of God comes upon him powerfully. David's probably only a teenager at this point. And in the text, Samuel gives no indication to David or Jesse as to what this anointing is for. He just anoints David and then leaves. Although I suspect everyone knew what was going on here by this time. It was a public matter when Saul disobeyed the Lord. And it was a public matter when Samuel declared that God had rejected Saul. And that happened multiple times. And now the same prophet shows up and anoints David. I think they knew. I think they finally put all the pieces together and knew what was going on here. Samuel didn't have to say anything. Instead, he just obeys God. He pours oil on David, and that's it. But for David, everything has just changed. Interestingly, though, he doesn't now look at his brothers and say, "Okay, my older brothers, I'm your leader now. Get your swords," which, although we learned before, they probably didn't have any. "But we're going to go march on Gibeah where Saul lives, and we're going to overthrow him. Because now the throne is mine." He doesn't do that. He just stands there, a teenager with oil running over him, maybe wondering how he's going to clean it up, because oil is terrible to clean up, right? Samuel leaves, and what does David do? Covered with oil? Well, we learn in future chapters, he goes back to tending his sheep. Nothing has changed for him. But in a way that really matters, everything has changed because he's now filled with the Spirit of God. And then the scene changes. And there's a major contrast in the narrative here. We leave David newly filled with the Spirit of God, and in verse 14 we read, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." So that Spirit of God that was now filling David had departed from Saul. The author of the story really wants us to see this side-by-side contrast. In this story, the Spirit of God is everything. God is looking for a man after his own heart, and he fills that man with his Spirit. But also notice that phrase in verse 14. Saul had an evil spirit from the Lord that tormented him. That's curious, right? Does God control evil spirits and send them to torment people? That's not how I think about God. I mean, does God do or send demons to do his bidding? Does anyone else think that sounds wrong? I mean, that's what Satan is supposed to do, right? Not God. So what's going on here? Well, scholars have speculated about this. We really, in the end, don't know, but some ideas are perhaps this was an ancient way of describing some sort of mental illness, a paranoia, a depression, maybe even bipolar or anxiety. We don't know. Could be. Or perhaps we should read this as not so much that God is sending the Spirit as much as maybe God is allowing the Spirit to torment Saul. In other words, maybe we should see that when God removes his Spirit from Saul, that measure of protection is now gone, and the evil spirit has access to Saul. It's hard to know. But some scholars said maybe we just need to read it as it is, that God actually did send an evil spirit. If so, why? Is he trying to speed Saul's decline? It's a difficult passage, and we're not totally sure what it means, but we will come against this in many passages in the future, because Saul, from this moment on, starts to fall apart significantly. And there's no psychologists in that age, no medication, there's no cognitive behavioral therapy, and Saul is absolutely not going to go to Samuel for help. He should have, though. The prophet of God, the priest. But to go to Samuel for help would be an admission of failure for Saul. And so just as Samuel is done with Saul, it seems like Saul is also done with Samuel. He's not going to humble himself to seek spiritual help or any help from the Lord. He was rejected by God. So who will help him? We read this in verse 15. Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." There's really just something special about music, isn't there? Music can change our mood. Music can make us happy, sad, nostalgic, reflective. It just really has this power to it. Play a song that you haven't heard in a long time, maybe even in decades, and you've almost forgotten it, but how many times do you still remember the words, and it transports you to where you were when you first learned to love that song? Powerful. In contemporary psychology, there is a legitimate form of therapy, musical therapy. So this plan to get musical therapy for Saul is a good one. In verse 18, Saul's attendants seek out a local musical therapist. We read this. One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Now we learn a lot about David here. He's not only the youngest of his brothers. He's not only a shepherd. He's also a musician, a warrior. He speaks well. He's handsome. He plays the lyre, which is kind of like a handheld harp with 7 or 8 strings. And it soothes Saul's condition. Now the NIV says Saul liked him very much. The Hebrew there could be translated, Saul loved David greatly. He makes David one of his armor bearers, which is a sign of how much he trusts David. And David becomes a fixture in Saul's court. So how about that? The newly anointed, soon-to-be king is secretly serving the old, unaware, current king. But that's God for you. He's able to take an impossible situation and make something possible out of it. I'm not saying he's going to make every situation perfect, as if David has like this just smooth pathway to the throne. David is about to endure some intense pain. We're going to see this in the weeks to come. And early on, it's no fault of his own. Down the road, he's going to make some mistakes that are totally his fault. But for now, in his journey to become king, He could easily think, I didn't ask for this. I was fine being a shepherd, writing my music and my poems. But now I'm struggling. And it's going to be some intense drama in the next few chapters. But here's the thing. When you give your heart to God, life will not necessarily be easier, but know that you will be obeying God in the best possible situation. David was a man after God's own heart. God saw that David gave his heart to the Lord. And so what about us? Is it possible for us to see the heart like God sees it? I mean, obviously not exactly like God sees it, but we can try. We can and should have a focus on the heart. Our hearts first, but also the hearts of other people. So how do we give proper attention to our hearts? Well, consider David. David is one of a long line of biblical stories where we could say these are unlikely choices. He's the youngest in the family. Unlikely that he would be chosen. Throughout Scripture, God so frequently chooses the unlikely that we start to come to expect it as likely. If you read a story in the Bible, the likely choice is almost always the person who is on the margins, the person who is oppressed, the person who is poor, the person who does not seem to be the one that should be chosen. So, that's why we don't look at the outward appearance, but we look at the heart. Next, know this. You are loved by God, valuable to God, and He sees in you what the world cannot see. When you have a heart by God, you are filled, a heart for God, you are filled by the Spirit. That means you're the person that God sees and wants to use for the work of His kingdom. It's not about your degree, your ethnicity, your lineage, your stature, your money, or your body. When it comes to the mission of God's kingdom, it's about your heart and the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. So give attention to your heart. Nurture a heart that beats for God. And one of the most important attitudes of nurturing a heart that beats for God is to have a healthy, honest self-awareness. We disciples are people who are eager to learn about our hearts, to learn about our weak spots, so that we can grow to be more like Jesus. And we look to Jesus. He's an example of this. Jesus overcame what some people call the PLM syndrome. Have you ever heard of that? This was a new one. I was just learning about it this week, actually. The PLM syndrome. It stands for people like me. Jesus overcame that syndrome. The PLM syndrome is a syndrome that says we humans tend to gravitate towards people like us. We feel that people like us are normal, and others who are not like us are abnormal. Over time, our friend groups tend to resemble people like us, who think like us, who live like us, who spend money like us. But read through the Gospels and notice how often Jesus intentionally reaches out to people not like him. The tax collectors, the women, the Pharisees, the sick, the poor. Not to mention the fact that in theology, we talk about something called incarnation, which is God taking on human flesh. He became a person not like himself. Jesus became something different when he took on flesh. He became like us. Let me conclude by telling you a cautionary tale of people who had a debilitating case of PLM. In the 1960s, our mother church, Grace EC Church, down in the city on Shippen and Locust Streets, was booming. Over 1,000 people. They had people coming downtown from East Lampeter, and so, in 1968, they planted Faith Church. Wonderful thing, visionary. But over the next few decades, their community in the city of Lancaster started to change. People of color moved into the neighborhood. And so the whites moved out. Interestingly, those whites, even though they started moving into the suburbs and away from their church building, they would still drive into town to go to church at their church building. Soon they started putting up no trespassing signs and a chain across the parking lot so people couldn't come in during the week. And then they would remove the chain on Sunday morning. The years went by, the decades went by, and attendance slowly dwindled away. They had PLM. People like me syndrome, looking at outward appearance and not reaching out in love with the good news of Jesus to people who look different from them. About 10 years ago, Grace EC Church in the city of Lancaster ceased to exist. Now, East Lampeter is changing. Will we look at the outward appearance? Will we succumb to PLM? Or will we look at the heart? First ours. Nurturing a heart after God that is filled with the Spirit, and then look at the heart of all our community around us. Because God looks at the heart.